Welcome to the multiplication mindset. It's a broad brushstroke, but that we can break up church planting into two different categories. The first is what we call pastoral church planting, and the second is what we call apostolic church planting. Depending on who you are and whether you're more pastoral or more apostolic, depends on which of those two approaches are going to be best for you. Knowing yourself, knowing what you lean towards, will help you to choose which of those two paths will help you to be able to start churches in a way that multiplies. So let's first of all begin with the pastoral approach. The pastoral approach begins with the church planter. The church planter will enter a field and they will begin to connect with people, and they'll establish a place where they can meet, and they will bring in people into that space and begin to pastor them, and the church planter will become the founding pastor. And then from there they'll begin to disciple them, raise up leaders, and then begin to multiply. The church planter typically begins with resources from the outside, where there is a support team that is helping them to have the resources to be able to have the time to go into a field and be able to establish the new church. And so the church planter builds a team, often a core people in their home, and then has a launch of their church service, and then again continues to connect with people and draw people in. So in the pastoral approach, the church planter becomes the pastor, builds the church up, and then as they develop leaders, they then can multiply from there. The apostolic model is where the church planter walks into a field and they begin to connect with people, and they're looking for people that God has already prepared. And when someone comes to faith, they meet in that person's home and begin to build that person up, and steps into that person's relational network and begins to build that person, or the leader within that community begins to build them up and establish a church around that particular community. And then the church planter, having established that church, would then move on to a new field, and all the while continuing to help that leader to grow in their pastoral role, and then to go on and to multiply. In the pastoral approach, the resources come from outside. In the apostolic approach, the resources come from outside. In the pastoral approach, the resources move into an established church, and as the church becomes financially viable, it then pays that church planter as the pastor. And in the apostolic approach, the resources go towards the apostolic church planter, and would continue to fund that church planter as they move from field to field, establishing first generation churches, and then helping those new pastors to be able to get to second, third, fourth generation. Both approaches work. Some of the key differences, though, is that in a pastoral approach, the desire of the person is to be the primary leader, to be the pastor. They're the ones that are having the vision, they're setting the direction, they're setting the culture of the church, along with their team, hopefully. They're still the leader, and that as they establish the church, they're setting the direction and following the vision that God has predominantly given to them. In the apostolic approach, the person is looking for someone who they will work with and through. So the apostolic leader is rarely up front in that regard. They're working alongside someone else, helping them to establish a church, helping them to raise leaders and to multiply. So the apostolic leader is looking for those pastoral types. Some of the weaknesses of both models. Well, in the pastoral approach, that transition from church planter to is one very specific role. It's a new creation role, whereas a pastoring role is more health, and establishment. So there's a significant shift in skills and competencies that a pastoral church planter requires to go from starting something new to building something and establishing it. That's asking for a very wide skill set. The other thing is that the person needs to be a gifted pastoral leader. As people come in with their problems, their time is going to shift from reaching new people to looking after the sheep that are in their church. That will diminish the time that can be spent in outreach, reaching new people and establishing new work. The downside of the apostolic leader is that they're always going to be in the background. They're always going to be unknown. They're working through other people and building other people up. So an apostolic leader isn't going to get that feedback of well done, good job, because it's largely a background role. Not to say that they're not going to have leadership in the community, of course they will. Of these two approaches, we see both of them in Scripture. When Jesus had his 12 apostles, he obviously used an apostolic church planting model. He trained the 12 to go into a village to find people of peace, to stay in that person's home, and then begin to establish churches from there. So Jesus trained the 12 and then the 72 in an apostolic church planting role. When we come across to the New Testament, we begin to see what's happening in Jerusalem throughout Acts, when we see what the apostles do when they go out and how those churches continue to function, as we see what happens throughout the epistles with Paul and with John and Peter. We do see that establishment of churches like Aquila and Priscilla, the church in their home, when John is writing to the lady and the people who meet in her home, or to the church that meet at Philippi. We see churches being established and we see pastors doing their role. So we see scripturally both approaches in Scripture. So it's not like one is right and one is wrong. They're both biblical, they both have their strengths, they both have their weaknesses. The question is, what kind of church planter do you want to be? What are the skill set that God has given you? Do you want to start a church and then really commit to that community of believers? You probably want to lean towards a pastoral approach. On the other hand, if you're happy to be in the background, if you want to see God work through other people, and you're more of an empowering, coaching type leader, then perhaps you want to consider an apostolic approach. Whichever way, God bless you in your endeavors. This is the Multiplication Mindset.